Welcome to episode 27 of Within the Boggart Wood. Today I'll be looking at the history of Nafferton in Northumberland, along with the murderous tale of Long Lonkin and a rather noisy ghost. Then I'll be looking at a ghostly tale from Whitby, and finally at the folklore of the Dun Cow. Before I start though, I'd like to thank everyone who has taken the time to listen and download episodes. The last episode took the podcast over the milestone 5,000 download mark. I'd also like to thank the 6 lovely people who have rated the podcast at 5 stars on Spotify. Unfortunately, I can't say who's provided the ratings, but know that you're very much appreciated. It's also been suggested that I upload the podcast episodes to YouTube. Let me know your thoughts in the Facebook group, or in the new forum that I've set up. With social media having a few issues of late, I thought it might be time to go a little more old school. I'll put a link to the forum on the main website socials and contacts page, as well as in the podcast episode description. So, onto the first story and a deep dive into Nafferton in Northumberland. In the early 13th century, Philip of Ulecoats, a name that I hope I've pronounced correctly, a knight in Northumberland and counsellor of northern affairs to King John, decided to build himself a new timber tower house on the road at Nafferton between Headon-on-the-Wall and Corbridge, on the western edge of the Whittle Burn. He'd already been bestowed the baronies of Matfern and Lawbottle, and Nafferton was enough to get the local gentry a little riled up, as well as the fact that Philip was one of the main supporters of King John against the northern barons. In AD 1218, William de Umfreville, based at the nearby fortress at Prudder, put a complaint to the crown, by then King Henry III, and Philip was commanded to cease and desist work on the castle and to demolish it. It seems, however, Philip refused to tear his new tower down, though in theory he may have stopped work, though there's no evidence to suggest one way or the other. 3 years passed along with Philip himself, with the timber tower still standing, but then the king ordered the tower dismantled again, and this time the structure was stripped, with the wood used both in the new jail and a tower for the bridge at Newcastle upon Tyne. The Sheriff of Northumberland also took, on behalf of the king, Nafferton and all of Philip's lands at nearby Newcastle. What remained at Nafferton was a large defensive enclosure, 45 metres wide, 72 metres long, with ramparts and a ditch. The rampart measured 6 metres wide, and the ditch 10 metres wide. The entrance to the interior was through the centre of the northern and western ramparts, with the ramparts themselves surmounted by a stone wall and palisade, with the stone permanently borrowed from the nearby Hadrian's Wall. Fast forward nearly 300 years to AD 1513, and the Earl of Westmoreland leased a plot of waste ground, located 60 feet off Nafferton Dyke, to Thomas Swinburne in order to build a new house. It is assumed that Nafferton Dyke likely referred to the south bank and ditch of the old castle. It's this new house for Swinburne that many assume to be a stone tower in the northwestern corner of the old ramparts, known locally as Lonkin's Hall. In the latter years of the 1950s, limited archaeological investigation took place at the site, with archaeologists from the medieval group of the Newcastle Society of Antiquaries examining the western rampart, the north gate, a stone foundation in the north section of the site, and also the stone tower. The tower was cleared of debris and modern rubbish. It was found that the walls measured between 3 feet and 4 feet 6 inches wide, with the door on the southeast side. 15th and 16th century pottery was found in the occupation layers beneath the collapsed roof. A further stone building was also found in the northern extent of the enclosure, found to be 15th to 16th century in date, but built over a 13th century building, the excavation of which revealed a good amount of 13th century pottery, primarily from cooking vessels. So, from archaeology we move to folklore. According to the 1926 volume of History of Northumberland, it seems that the local view of Nafferton as a place of supernatural beings may even derive from the early medieval period, with the name Nafferton suggested to be a hybrid of the Old Norse Natfari, meaning wanderer by night, and Tun, meaning homestead or village. Nafferton is also separated from Welton by the Bogle Burn, with of course bogle being a term often used in Northumberland to denote the presence of a goblin or spirit. In the 19th century, the woods around the ruined tower house were said to be haunted, with a dark entity residing in the ruin. And then we come to the story of Long Lonkin. As with most folklore, there are a number of versions of who Lonkin was, with over 20 versions known across Britain by the mid-19th century. A number of these versions exist associated with Nafferton. The first is that Long Lonkin was a moss trooper, a 17th century brigand who lived by highway robbery, thievery and cattle rustling. Lonkin had taken a liking to a local lady, but she preferred the Lord of Nafferton, to whom she got married and had a child. Enraged, Lonkin vowed revenge and put a plan in motion. He worked his way into the affections of the newborn's maid, named Orange, who sent him a message one day to say that the Lord was heading to London and would be leaving his wife and newborn behind at Nafferton. With the Lord on the road to London, Lonkin arrived under the cover of night and was let into the house by Orange. Inside he found the child on the ground floor with the maid, but the lady was in her chambers on the floor above. Taking a knife, he then pricked at the child till it screamed, and the lady, hearing her child crying, rushed down to find out what was wrong and met a gruesome end at the point of Lonkin's knife. Not satisfied, Lonkin then also killed the child. This dark legend goes that the Lord of Nafferton, on the road to London, was suddenly overcome by a feeling of doom and that something wasn't right at home. Trying to shake that feeling off, he continued on his journey, but then suddenly the silver buttons popped off his coat without warning, and his finger ring was broken too. Recognising the omen, he ordered his carriage to turn around and made haste back home. Upon his approach to the castle, he saw Lonkin fleeing into a dene by the Whittle burn. The Lord hurried into the castle and saw his dead wife and child, and the maid Orange, not willing to be held solely accountable, told him exactly who had done the deed. Lonkin was then hunted for the rest of the night, but it wasn't until morning that he was found, huddled in a large tree overhanging a deep pool of water in the burn. With nowhere to run, the Lord of Nafferton threatened to shoot him out of the tree, but instead Lonkin threw himself into the pool below and sank out of sight, never to be seen again, or at least seen again alive. From then on it was named Lonkin's Pool, and it was said that on the anniversary of his crime, Lonkin's ghost would emerge from the pool and haunt the dene. That's one story, of course. In another version, Lonkin was boiled alive in a pot of molten lead for his crimes. In another he was hanged. In another he was imprisoned in the tower and left to starve to death, and when his body was found he had apparently tried consuming his own flesh to stay alive. In all versions his accomplice Orange had the same fate. She was burnt to death at the stake. For some folklorists that were perhaps a little more au fait with the history of Nafferton, the story transferred to Welton Hall, a mile north of Nafferton. In that version, Lonkin murdered the lady and her son on the hall's spiral stone stairs, where the ironstone staining is still said to be their bloodstains. The lady's restless spirit is said to haunt the hall, her presence heralded by the rustling of a silk dress, naming her as one of the many Silkies of Northumberland. Escaping from the returning lord, Lonkin fled but was killed by a falling branch of an oak tree next to a local well, the waters of which are said to turn red with blood on the anniversary of his death. In this version, Lonkin's treasure is resting at the bottom of Lonkin's Pool. Yet another version has Lonkin as the head of a group of highwaymen who used the tower at Nafferton as their base. According to Mackenzie in 1825, Lonkin eventually hanged himself at the tower and was left there to rot by his fellow highwaymen. Mackenzie even stated that his skull lay knocking about in the castle for a long time but has now disappeared. While researching the story, I did find an interesting version found in the World War II service newspaper called Good Morning, which was the daily paper of the submarine branch between 1943 and 1945. The piece, bizarrely entitled Dirty Work of the Bathroom Ghost, was in the 21st of January 1945 edition. I've only got one eye, but it has roved over a few murderers since I began my newspaper career, and I've listened, sometimes for days on end, to some grim stories of murder and the events that led up to their commission. You submariners have been reading in past issues of Good Morning some magnificent stories by Stuart Martin about crooks and their evil ways. This is Barney Bedford bringing you one of the strangest murder stories of all time. I didn't find it in the sombre precincts of a high court either. I found it in the old records of Harlow Hall, one of Northumberland's fine ancestral homes, and I read the grim story by the side of the fire in the world's biggest kitchen. You go back into history a long way before you catch up with Long Lonkin. He was around in 1614, and did the neighbours know it? In particular, Lonkin angered Long Will of Welton. Now Long Will was a bit of a celebrity too. He and Lonkin were the tallest men in the county, but whereas Lonkin never did a decent day's work in his life, Welton was an industrious worker and made his castle at Harlow Hall noted for its splendour and taste. Maybe it was business, but something lured Will away to the capital and caused him to leave behind his wife and their newly born son. Before he left, Will gave strict instructions that his wife and the child were to be well protected, and as he had been having a bit of trouble with Scots who kept organising raiding forays across the border, he had built himself a stone tower as a safeguard. He figured that if the missus and the baby were housed in there, no harm would come to them while he was away. So after provisioning the old keep, Will went on his way, leaving his dearly beloved in the care of a wench by the name of Orange. Now, Orange was a careless sort of dame. The most important job she had to do was to secure the 6 windows of the keep every night. She made the greatest mistake of her life when she forgot to catch the lot one night. 5 she fastened, 1 she left unbolted. Long Lonkin soon found the Achilles heel. Like a snake, he swarmed over the sill, or whatever it was they called the darn thing in those days, and his eyes lit on Orange, rocking the babe in a cradle by the fire. The mistress of the house was someplace else. Like a true villain, Lonkin cat-footed across the room, clouted Orange under the ear with a good stout stick. It's too good a phrase to pass up, so I'll use it. She fell like a log. How to lure the mother without waking up the menials was the next problem, but Lonkin soon solved it. He caught up the baby and pinched it good and proper. Alarmed by the baby's cries, the mother hurried into the room, only to be confronted by her husband's bitterest enemy. The guys that wrote the account of Long Lonkin and his foul deeds simply record that he... I won't use the old spelling because my typewriter isn't fitted up for that sort of thing. Split her with his staff and dragged her by the hair to a bottomless pool where he threw her in. Lonkin then ransacked the keep in Harlow Hall and beat it. Will must have been pretty sore when he returned from town because he hunted Lonkin until his death, but never tagged on somehow. Anyway, you can drop in at Harlow Hall when you're next on leave and see the old keep, still weathering the blasts that blow across the Tyne Valley as well as it did in Lonkin's day. And rosy-cheeked Mrs. Byerley, her husband's family have lived there for 100 years now, will show you Will Welton's initials carved in stone over the door, and will take you up to the room where the murder was committed. The Byerleys have turned part of it into a bathroom, despite the fact that Mrs. Welton's ghost is supposed to walk there every year. I've bathed at all hours of the night and have never heard anything unusual, Mrs. Byerley told me. Maybe not, but I'd need more than a smile to clothe me if I was in the bath on the anniversary of Long Lonkin's dirty work. Yes, sir. But this isn't the end of folklore associated with Nafferton, and from the castle we move to Nafferton New Hall, said to have been built 1 mile to the west of the castle. This house hasn't left much of an impression in history, with only 2 small drawings of it made in 1842 showing a 3-storied tower with a 2-story extension. It had probably been demolished by the mid-19th century, before which it was in use as a farm. It is known that it was an occasional house for the Derwentwater Radcliffe family, who left the property for Dilston Hall in 1768. However, it is said that whenever the property was occupied by a Radcliffe, strange things would occur. Apparitions would be seen to herald a birth, death or accident, often taking the form of a white hen, rabbit or weasel, or sometimes even the figure of a person dressed in white but missing their head. Strange noises would be heard throughout the house, knocking on doors and windows and unearthly shrieks being heard from empty rooms. Doors would open themselves and refuse to be shut. By the early 1800s, the hall had been turned into a farm. The farmer had become used to the strange noises in his home until one night it became too frightening. He was woken to a horrendous din, which seemed to be coming from the fireplace in his room. As he approached, he found the noise was actually coming from the hearthstone. Determined to find out the source of this unearthly annoyance, he called for his brother, and together they dug out the stone and found that there was a large cavity beneath it that had been deliberately backfilled. They removed the debris, and as they did so, on 2 occasions they thought they heard a voice urging them on. Eventually they cleared out a small room, a priest hole where Roman Catholic priests would have hidden during the persecutions in the 16th century. Finding nothing to account for the noises, however, the farmer searched the room and found a loose floor slab. Lifting it, he found a further room below, stuffed with wood shavings and manure. Digging it out, they found the room was a second priest hole, and again there was a further chamber below, again filled with horse manure. Digging this third room out, they also found a bloodied shirt and a nightcap. The shirt apparently looked almost new, but on exposure to fresh air the linen shriveled up. A small relief to the farmer, but the noises had stopped upon finding the bloodied shirt. However, he remained curious and began asking around. He was told that soon after the Radcliffes left in 1768, the hall had been made into an inn with the rooms let out to hunters during the shooting season. One day a peddler of fine linens came to the inn and never left. Rumour had it that he'd been murdered, but there was never any evidence. However, it was soon observed that the innkeeper's daughters were dressed above their station. which some recognised as being made of some of the cloth that the missing peddler had been selling, but as no body could be found, nothing could be done. But it is said that the fortunes of the innkeeper and his family turned sour and eventually led to their ruin. To the farmer, though, this was a good explanation of the source of the ghostly activity. The peddler's remains, however, were never found. This episode from the Archives tale is titled A Ghost at Whitby and comes from the Northern Echo dated Tuesday 8th of December 1891. Now that the question of ghosts and apparitions has been so very prominently brought to the front by Mr. W.T. Stead's Real Ghost Stories, it may not be inopportune for me to bring under the notice of your readers a real ghost story which is associated with my own family. My father commenced his career as a boy in His Majesty's Navy and was drafted at the age of 21 into the Coast Guard service, being stationed at Black Rock, Brighton, where he married my mother, the daughter of a farmer residing near the village of Crawley in the county of Sussex. Some years afterwards he was sent down to the village of Goldsborough in Yorkshire, some 5 miles north of Whitby. In these days of easy and rapid communication, the manner on which that journey was made is interesting. First, it was by carrier's wagon from Eastbourne to London, and from London by the only steam passenger paddle boat at the time plying between the Thames and the Humber, named the Strensel. At the time this was the second largest paddle boat afloat, the largest being a 6-masted paddle steamer which then plied between the Thames and the Tyne, called the Great Britain. Of course, screw propellers were entirely unknown. I was then a child in arms, and our family comprised my father and mother, myself and 2 elder brothers. On arriving at Hull, we had again to proceed by carrier's wagon to Whitby, and from thence again by carrier the other 5 miles to the little village of Goldsborough. When we reached this place, it was found that there was no house of any kind available as a habitation for us, but after making numerous inquiries, we found shelter in the wing of a farmhouse which for some time previously had been unoccupied. We had not been in this particular house more than about a month, when one night my father, coming in, as was his nightly custom, between 11 and 1 o'clock, as his rounds permitted, was sitting in the little kitchen and was about to take from the oven his coffee and toast for supper, when just as he was reaching to the oven, the fender upon one of his feet was resting, lifted up from the hearthstone 3 times and fell again with a loud bang. Concurrently with this action on the part of the fender, one half of a double-doored long closet opened 3 times also, and slammed to again louder, my father always said, than he could have done himself. Mother, who was sleeping in a room on the same level, called out to father, "James, what is that?" He replied, "Betsy, I don't know. It's very strange." However, they heard no more that night, and father finished his coffee and had his pipe and went out again. He came in the morning and said to his wife, "That was a very strange thing last night, Betsy." She rejoined, It was very strange. What could it be?" He said, "I don't think it meant anything," and then, "Did James, my elder brother, hear it?" Mother replied, "Yes, he did." That made my father think it even more strange, but nothing further was said, and for many nights he went about his business as usual. About a month afterwards, however, when he was out one night, and about half an hour before the time he generally came in, my mother, who was lying in bed asleep with me in her arms, felt the bed lifted 3 times and banged down on the floor with a loud noise. Simultaneously with the bed lifting, there were 3 distinct and very loud sounds of pistol shots fired over the bed. My mother screamed out, as also did my brother James upstairs, and she then lay in bed almost paralysed with fear, praying as she said she never prayed before for father to come in. When he came, she told him and said, "I dare not stay in the house. You must see and get out of it as soon as possible." And he replied, "I will do so." After she had told him this, and while he was sitting having his pipe, he heard, and she almost heard distinctly, outside the window what seemed to them 2 dogs in deadly combat, fighting and tearing each other to pieces. Father said, "Do you hear that?" She said, "Yes," and then also began to be a little scared. He got his cutlass and went to the front door, but could see nothing, and he made up his mind then that he would inquire about the matter, having up to this time kept his own counsel. A Mrs. Buick, a widow, who was living in the other portion of the farmhouse, told him that the last people who had lived there said that there was something wrong about the house, and she personally knew nothing, although only separated by a wall. Within a week or two of this, father was down on the sands one day with mother, and were making their way from the top of the cliff to a subsidence of the cliff which had occurred probably centuries before, and at this time was beautifully wooded. As they were going down, the then Marquis of Normanby, the great Marquis, who was then a member of Sir Robert Peel's government, and was subsequently our ambassador at the French court, came down with his beautiful Marchioness, one of Her Majesty's bridesmaids and maids of honour, on their way to the Ladies' Walk, where there was a beautiful grotto in which they used to sit. Father raised his hat to the Marquis, who said, "I suppose you are the new coastguardsman?" He said, "Yes, my lord," and told him his name. The Marquis said, "Have you got a comfortable house?" And he then told his lordship briefly the story. His lordship said, "I have heard something about that before. It is very strange that there is anything in it," and father repeated the story. The Marquis then said, "You shall not stay there any longer than it is possible to provide you with some other place. I will get my steward to at once put a cottage in the village in order for you." With that, the Marchioness turned to my mother and myself and stooped down to kiss me, but I turned away my face and would not let her kiss me, so my mother used to say. Unfortunately, handsome ladies have not since then given me the opportunity of refusing their chaste salutes. In a little time after this, my father got into the cottage, which the Marquis speedily made ready for him. But meanwhile, after father had spoken to the Marquis, and while the cottage was being prepared, it was found necessary by the owners of the farmhouse, on father's representation, to bring a joiner in from Whitby to make some repairs in an upstairs bedroom. My brother James, then 12 years of age, was upstairs with him, and whilst the man was busy at the window, he knowing nothing and having no suspicion of the building, all at once a male figure, draped in white, appeared, coming apparently from nowhere, crossed the room and vanished. The joiner, affrighted, threw his tools down and rushed downstairs, followed by the boy James, who was screaming at the top of his voice. Father was downstairs, and the joiner told him what they had seen. Nothing could induce him to go and fetch his tools, and ultimately my father had to go for them. We lived in the house in the village for some years, and then my father was promoted again and sent to Redcar. After we had been there a few years, and I had grown up to be 13 years of age, my father, on the invitation of a Mr. Watson, who farmed the principal farm on the estate of the Marquis of Normanby near Goldsborough, again visited the neighbourhood and took me with him. Amongst other subjects that naturally came up in conversation between them was the question of the haunted farmhouse. My father asked, "Did those who went into the house after us have any similar experience to what we had?" Mr. Watson replied, "I am glad, James, that you have named that. A few years after you left, Mrs. Buick, who had the other part of the house, died, and the house was repaired and done up and let in its entirety to another man. Before he entered into possession, the new tenant had the interior very much modernised, and amongst other things the flagged floor in the kitchen was taken up, and of course the hearthstone along with it, and under the hearthstone was found a human skeleton." I'll now finish this episode off with William Brockie's tale of the Dun Cow, as told in his 1886 Legends and Superstitions of the County of Durham. The precise spot designed for the permanent residence of the mortal remains of the blessed St. Cuthbert was indicated to the monks of Lindisfarne on their return from their flight to Ripon in the manner following. 4 months after their arrival at Ripon, says Patrick Sanderson in his History of the Abbey and Cathedral Church of Durham, the Danish war ceased, and they intended to bring him, St. Cuthbert, again to Chesler Street, and coming with him on the east side of Durham to a place called Warden Law, they could not with all their force remove the body further, for it seemed fastened to the ground, which great and unforeseen accident produced great astonishment in the hearts of the bishops, the monks, and their associates. Whereupon they fasted and prayed 3 days with great devotion, to know by invitation from God what to do with said body, which was soon granted to them, it being revealed to a virtuous man that he should be carried to Dunholm, where he was to be received to a place of rest. They were again in great distress, in not knowing where Dunholm lay, but as they proceeded, a woman wanting her cow called aloud to her companion to know if she had seen her. The companion answered she was in Dunholm. This was a happy and heavenly sound to the distressed monks, who thereby had intelligence that their journey's end was at hand, and the saint's body near its resting place. Therefore with great joy they arrived with his body at Dunholm in the year 997. Hence the effigies of the Dun Cow in the west corner tower of the east transept of the cathedral. This legend, however, is not mentioned by Simeon of Durham or any other old historian, and rests wholly on the sculpture. Of the other innumerable legends relating to St Cuthbert, we need take no notice here. We do not remember that any of them now circulate generally among the people, all being confined to books and bookmen. In the same category, we may place the legends about St Godric, the anchorite, who made Finkel famous. Thanks for listening to the episode. As always, please see the episode description for links to the project website and social media, as well as the new discussion forum. And if you do enjoy the podcast and have a minute or two spare, please consider leaving a review on your favourite podcasting platform to help the show reach more listeners. Until next time, stay safe and don't forget to lock all your castle windows.